The contract read like a threat aimed at the sea. Item: for the outer mole, pulvis puteolanus, drawn only from the fields between Vesuvius and Cumae. The mixture shall be poured directly into the water, where it will harden into one unbroken mass. This structure is guaranteed not for the life of the man who builds it, but for the life of Rome. Failure brings no fine. It brings the striking of the contractor's name from every public record, forever. These were not building instructions. This was an order given to the laws of nature, signed under the authority of an emperor who believed such an order could be obeyed. The Romans were not laying a harbor. They were manufacturing new ground where no ground had ever been. Our witness is a man named Lucius, a military engineer raised in the forests of Gaul. At first light, he stands on the coast of Judea, a shore that smells of salt, dust, and simmering revolt. He has been sent here on assignment, ordered to watch the rising of King Herod's port at Caesarea, a work paid for by Roman knowledge and by a client king's fear of Rome. Lucius trusts what he can touch. He knows the honest logic of stone stacked on stone, the reliable pull of a seasoned oak beam, the clean geometry of a wall. He builds on firm earth. What lies in front of him breaks every rule he owns. A city is being raised out of open water. The scale is enormous. 10,000 laborers and 1,000 groaning carts make a noise he feels through the soles of his feet. To his ordered mind, it looks like chaos with a paymaster. A beautiful, ruinously expensive error. He has come to steal a secret. But the secret is not the one he imagines. The concrete sinking into these waves will outlive the empire that ordered it poured. That is the smaller marvel. The larger one is stranger still. The same sea now hammering this wall, trying to break it apart, will spend the next 2,000 years quietly making it harder. Every wave that strikes the barrier will become part of the barrier. This is the riddle Lucius must solve. He thinks he is hunting a lost recipe, some hidden grain in the mix that gives the stuff its impossible strength. He's looking in the wrong place. The answer is not in the bucket. It sits in the mind of the people who dared to pour it into the sea, a way of seeing the world that has since vanished from the earth. Let us know which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel to support this project and keep these stories alive. You're watching Romanus, your home of Roman Empire on YouTube. The clock in the foreman's tent showed the first hour after sunrise. To Lucius, it felt like the opening of a world that ran on rules he had never learned. He stood on a plank platform above the work site, the sea breeze doing nothing against the grit that had settled on his tongue. Back home in Gaul, building was an act of order. You cleared the ground, you cut a foundation, you raised the work upward, one honest stone at a time, against the plain and predictable pull of gravity. Here they were building the wrong way, sideways, downward, into a place that had never belonged to men. They were meeting the sea on the sea's own ground, and to his eye, they were being beaten. The harbor had a name already, though it stood half drowned in scaffolding. Sebastos, Greek for Augustus. Herod had named his masterwork after the emperor who kept him on his throne, and the flattery was carved into the very shape of the place. The port faced west, toward Rome, as if the whole coast had turned to bow. Josephus, who saw Caesarea finished, wrote that the king built it against the natural grain of the shore, on a stretch that had no bay, no shelter, nothing but exposed rock and open surf, where sailors had drowned for generations. That was the point. Herod was not improving a harbor. He was inventing one where the sea had refused to grant it. The work had begun around 22 BC and would run 12 years before the city was dedicated. Lucius had arrived in the middle of it, into the noise and the mud of a thing not yet born. Barges rode low in the swell, while crews of Judean laborers unloaded them, backs shining under the early sun. They carried no cut stone. They carried a fine gray dust. Lucius watched it heaped into hills along the shore, and it stirred nothing in him. It looked like ash left after a great fire had burned itself out. His guide was a Greek engineer named Demetrios, a man with the worn eyes of someone who had argued too long with a deadline he could not win. He pointed at the pile. "The heart of the whole thing," he said, his voice cracked from shouting over the noise of the sight. "Pulvis puteolanus, the powder of Puteoli." Lucius knew the name. Every engineer in the empire knew it. It was the stuff of stories. A volcanic earth carried at ruinous cost from the fields around Vesuvius, yet seeing it in the flesh emptied the legend out. It was dirt. Nearby he saw the rest of it being made ready. Heaps of lime, mounds of rough volcanic rubble for aggregate, and clay pots stacked in rows, brought from the pottery towns to be filled and sunk as spacers in the wall. It all looked crude to him. Too much faith placed on one magic handful of earth. His gaze went out to the water, and there the true reach of the thing revealed itself. Hundreds of feet offshore, huge wooden shapes rolled in the waves. Caissons, hollow rectangular giants built on land, floated into place, then packed with the concrete until they dropped to the seabed and became the mold for the harbor wall. It was audacity made physical. Demetrios told him the numbers as they walked, the way a man recites a debt he cannot forget. The outer mole ran near 200 feet across at its widest. It closed off some 40 acres of sea, water deep enough to float grain ships that could feed a city through a winter. On the breakwater, Herod meant to raise towers, and the tallest he would name, Drusian, after Drusus, the emperor's stepson, dead young and mourned across the empire. Lucius heard the flattery in every stone, a king spending a fortune he had squeezed from a bitter province and carving the names of the imperial family into the result, so no one at Rome could mistake whose loyalty had paid for it. The timber for the caissons had come from Lebanon. Demetrios said, cedar and pine felled in the mountains and floated down the coast. Every plank had traveled to die under the sea. He walked to a stretch of the mole finished months before, a long wall of manufactured rock already claimed by algae and barnacles. He set his hand against it. The surface was rough, uneven, marked everywhere by the disorder of its making. It carried none of the clean edges of the marble temples in Rome, none of the tight-fitted stonework of the aqueducts he had helped raise. This was something less refined, something that seemed to have grown rather than been shaped. Gulls had already made it theirs, and their cries mixed with the ring of hammers until the two sounds could not be told apart. His trained eye went looking for the fault, and the fault did not hide long. He crouched and ran a finger across the coarse gray until he found it. A chalky white lump sunk into the mass, no larger than his thumbnail. A lime clast. To any soldier or fisherman walking past, it would have meant nothing. A random blemish in a random wall. To Lucius, it was a confession. A pocket of lime that had never mixed, never reacted, left raw inside the stone. Careless work. On a roadbed, a flaw like this would open into a crack after the first hard frost. In a fortress wall, it would give a siege engine a place to bite. Here, in a barrier meant to hold back the Mediterranean for centuries, it read to him as a sentence already passed. He pressed a note into the wax tablet he carried. One word: impurity. He had come to learn, but he had also come to judge, and the verdict forming in him was harsh. This great work, this ornament of Herod's kingdom, was being raised on poor material and reckless method. In his tent, away from the dust and the din, Lucius kept the one authority he trusted without reserve: a scroll, a careful copy of Vitruvius, the Architectura, the ground text, beneath all Roman building. He unrolled it with slow hands, the dry papyrus a small comfort in a place that felt like organized madness. His finger followed the lines, words as firm underfoot as a well-laid road. Vitruvius wrote of the volcanic powder with something close to worship. "There is a kind of powder," the text ran, "which by natural cause brings about results past belief. Mixed with lime and rubble, it lends strength to ordinary buildings. And when piers of it are set in the sea, they harden under the water." Lucius had read the passage 100 times. He had believed every word. It was the teaching of a master, a man who had served under the deified Augustus and dedicated the whole work to him. But here on this shore, watching the frantic thing on the beach with his own eyes, that belief bent under the weight of what he saw. Vitruvius spoke of proportion, of order, of measured science. The beach spoke of shouting men and brute repetition and heat. He rolled the scroll shut. The theory was clean. The practice was a brawl. Vitruvius had written something else, and it surfaced in Lucius now with a sour edge. The old engineer warned that lime clasts, those very white lumps, were the mark of a builder who slaked his lime badly or hurried his mix, a fault to be avoided at all cost. Yet here, the fault was everywhere, and no one seemed to care. Either the men of Caesarea had never read the master, or they knew something the master had not written down. Lucius could not yet imagine which was worse. The clock marked the 4th hour. The mixing began, and Lucius watched a heresy performed in the open air. Everything in his training, everything he had learned of how mortar takes and holds, told him that what these men were doing was wrong. The proper way was fixed and beyond argument. You took the quicklime, the caustic calcium oxide that could burn a hand to the bone, and you slaked it. Water added slow and careful, the violent reaction penned inside a controlled pit. The lime would hiss and heave and give off great heat, then settle into a safe, stable putty. Only then did you fold in the aggregate and water to make your mortar. That was the single road to a bond you could trust. The crews at Caesarea did none of it. They took the quicklime dry and raw and threw it straight into the mix with the ash and the rubble. What later builders would name hot mixing. The heaps began to steam at once, and not from the sun. A fierce heat rose from within the batch itself, the reaction that should have been tamed in a pit now running loose inside the mortar. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees, hot enough to scald flesh that touched it. Lucius watched a young laborer flinch back from the edge of a batch, sucking a burned knuckle, then wade in again with his shovel because a foreman was already shouting. To Lucius, this was no shortcut. It was a craftsman losing his mind. It would leave the finished stone shot through with fine fractures and pockets of raw, unsettled lime, the very clasts he had already found and cursed. It looked wrong. It felt like handling a blade by the edge. By every rule ever set before him, it was a formula for a wall that would fall before it stood. The men themselves came from the length of the empire, and their voices told the story of how far Rome reached to make one harbor. Judean farmers pressed into the work by a king who taxed them and then paid them to sink his ambitions into the sea. Greek engineers like Demetrios, heirs to the harbor builders of Alexandria and Rhodes, divers, prized above all, men who could hold their breath long enough to guide a caisson down onto its footing and check that it had seated true. One of them, an old Cypriot with ruined ears, was pointed out to Lucius as the finest on the coast, a man who had worked the sponge bed since boyhood and could stay under longer than any two others. He wore a rope around his waist and a stone tied to his ankle to drag him down fast, and the boys on the barge counted aloud until he tugged to be raised. Josephus records that Herod brought in workmen and materials at a scale the coast had never seen, and that the king watched the progress himself when he came down from his palace above the shore. That palace jutted out into the water on its own rock spur, with a freshwater pool set inside the salt, so that the sea surrounded a man swimming in sweet water, a king who bent even that small stretch of the Mediterranean to his taste. The harbor below was only the same appetite made vast. The whole enterprise, Lucius understood, could only exist because it was not one man's business. It was the act of a state. Lift the eye from his troubled face and rise above the coast of Judea. Move west over the Great Sea, back along the shipping lanes, and the source appears. The volcanic fields near the Bay of Naples, the quarries, the gangs of laborers cutting the gray powder out of the earth, the deep-hulled cargo ships, the naves honorarii, built heavy to bear a weight that would sink an ordinary vessel. This was not trade. This was a machine, a supply chain owned and driven by the imperial will, a conveyor of stone and dust that was moving a volcano across 1,000 miles of open water, one hold at a time. The aim was never only a harbor. The aim was to press a new fact onto a stubborn stretch of coast. Caesarea would be Roman by force of engineering, a deep-water port able to berth an entire legionary fleet, a market that would bind the restless province of Judea to the wealth and the armies of Rome. The cost climbed beyond counting, but the cost of not building it, of leaving this coast open, was reckoned higher still. Every barge of ash, every block of lime, was one tile in a vast design of control. There was a shadow over all of it that Lucius could feel, even if he could not name it. Herod ruled by Rome's leave and by nothing else. Rome had made him king of Judea in 40 BC, and Rome could unmake him. The whole coast knew it, every tower named for a dead prince, every acre of harbor named Sebastos, was a message shouted west across the water. See how loyal I am. See what I build in your name. A man does not spend a treasury on flattery unless he is afraid. And Herod, who had killed sons and a wife to keep his throne, had reason to be. The harbor was armor worn against the day Rome might tire of him. Lucius, standing on the shore, was looking at fear turned into stone. The men who worked the site knew that fear from below. The farmers hauling ash had watched their harvests taxed to pay for a port that no fisherman among them would ever own a berth in. Josephus, born in this land 2 generations later, would write of a country where the weight of Herod's building fell on the poor and where resentment ran under the surface like water under limestone. The same coast that swallowed this concrete would, within a century, rise in the revolt that burned Jerusalem. Lucius could not see that far, but he could hear it in the flat obedience of the men around him, in the way they did not sing at their work. Only the drum kept time, and the sea answered it. Herod had learned to build, in part, from Rome's own master. Marcus Agrippa, the emperor's right hand, had dredged harbors and cut canals across Italy, and Herod counted him a friend. When Agrippa visited the East, the king spread his cities before him like a man showing off a workshop. Caesarea was meant to stand in that company, a provincial answer to the ports of Italy. To fail here was to fail in front of the only audience Herod cared about. The work of tracing the Roman Empire is enormous, and telling these stories with the depth they deserve takes real resources. The members of this channel are the ground it all stands on. They are the ones who keep watch over this history. If you believe in the mission, if these old stones pull at you, then take your post. Join the Praetorian Guard, our channel's membership, and step into the inner circle that keeps this project standing. By joining, you become more than a viewer. You become a patron, making sure the legacy of Rome is carried forward and told with the weight it demands. You get early access to our documentaries and other perks. But beyond that, you become part of the legion that makes the whole thing possible. Take your place in the ranks. The link is waiting in the description below. 12 noon. The sun stood straight overhead, hard on the white sand and the turquoise water. The pour began. Barges, heavy with the hot, steaming concrete, were pulled and winched out to the wooden caissons rocking in the bay. Men called orders in a tangle of Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, voices overlapping until they became a single sound. On the breakwater, a foreman kept time with a drum, and the divers slipped over the side between beats, dark shapes vanishing into the churn to guide the load home. With a grinding of rope through pulley, the barge bottom swung open and the sides were tipped. The gray slurry poured down into the sea. It did not sink clean. It disappeared in a boiling cloud of silt and steam that turned the clear shallows into a churning milk. The smell of it reached the shore, mineral and sharp, the breath of scalded lime meeting cold salt water. Lucius stood on the shore with his arms folded, his face set in plain disapproval. He watched load after load of the overheated, unstable mixture vanish under the surface. He believed he knew exactly what was happening down there, where no eye could follow. The seawater would strip the lime out, dissolving the one thing that made the mixture bind before it could ever set. The aggregate would drift down into a loose, useless heap on the seabed. This was not construction. This was the careful, well-organized, staggeringly expensive building of a rubbish pile on the ocean floor. He thought of the contract in the archive, the clause that promised to strike the builder's name from every record forever. Whoever had signed that, he thought, had signed his own ruin. He was so certain of it that he had already composed the verdict in his head. He turned to Demetrios to speak it aloud. And that was when he noticed the Greek was not watching the pour at all. He was watching Lucius, and on his worn face was the faint, patient smile of a man who has heard every one of these objections before, from better engineers than the one beside him, and has watched the sea prove each of them wrong. 2 hours past noon, the heat sat at its highest, rising off the sand and the pale stone of the half-built city, until the air over the ground seemed to shimmer. Demetrios led Lucius away from the wreckage of the morning's pour and out onto the northern breakwater, a stretch finished nearly a year before. The clamor of the work fell behind them. In its place came an older sound, deeper and steadier, the beat of the Mediterranean throwing itself against the wall. A westerly wind drove the swell in, and each wave burst against the manufactured coast in a plume of white that drifted back and salted Lucius's face. He felt the strike of every one of them, a low shudder that ran up through the soles of his sandals and settled in his chest. This was the enemy, a tireless liquid force that could wear a mountain down to sand if you gave it enough centuries. A force this wall had been ordered to defy. Lucius walked the broad, flat top of the mole with his doubt fully awake again. The heresy of the hot mixing had only sharpened his certainty that the whole project was a gamble measured in a king's gold, bound for the seabed. Now he would find the proof and write it down. From here, the shape of the whole harbor lay open below him. Josephus described it as a haven larger than the Piraeus, the great port of Athens, and Lucius could believe it. Warehouses were rising along the quay in courses of pale stone. Behind them, the frame of a temple climbed on a platform above the water, meant to face incoming ships with statues of Rome and of the emperor, so that a sailor's first sight of the coast would be Augustus looking back at him. To the south stood the sockets, where 6 great bronze figures would anchor the harbor mouth, 3 on each side, a gate of metal men. Herod was not building a port. He was building a face for his kingdom to wear when it looked west. Demetrios named the parts as they walked, the way a man names the rooms of a house he built. The southern arm they called procumaton. A tower on the mole would hold rooms for sailors, and a promenade above the water where the wealthy of the new city could stroll and watch the fleet come in. Along the quay, Demetrios said, Arched vaults were being cut into the stone as lodgings and stores. Every foot of it was designed to be seen, to say to any captain out of Alexandria or Rhodes that a great power had reached down and remade the shore to suit itself. Lucius was not simply looking for faults, he was hunting them. He ran his palm along the wall and read the surface the way a physician reads a body, feeling for the signs of decay his years had taught him to expect. He studied the seams, where one day's pour met the next, watching for the line where they had begun to part. He crouched at the base, where the waves worked hardest, searching for the hollow that undercutting leaves behind. For close to an hour he found nothing but a solidity that gave him nothing to seize on. The wall did not feel assembled. It felt grown, a single body fused to the rock beneath the water, without a joint an attacker could pry. It was maddening. Demetrios trailed him without a word, an expression on his weathered face that hovered near amusement. The Greek had built harbors before. He had let slip on the walkout, on the coast near Puteoli, where he had learned the trade as a boy, hauling ash for his father. He had watched Italian moles take the sea for 40 years and had never seen one dissolve. Lucius shut him out and narrowed his focus. He knew the truth of his trade. Water is the most patient killer there is. It asks for no more than a gap, the width of a hair. It finds the path, it settles in, it freezes and swells and splits the hardest stone from within. That is a law older than Rome, older than any people. No clever recipe could overturn it. And then he saw it. A dark, wet line running down the gray of the wall from the top, standing out plainly against the drier stone around it. A hairline crack. Lucius knelt, and a grim satisfaction moved through him. He waved Demetrios closer. The crack was slight, the kind of thing an untrained eye would walk past 100 times. But he knew what it was. A mortal wound, the first symptom of an illness with only one ending. Seawater was weeping from it in a slow, steady thread, water that had already found its way into the core of the structure. "There," Lucius said, his voice level, one finger laid against the flaw. "The sea has found its way in." He looked up at the Greek, expecting alarm, expecting the shared dread of one professional recognizing another's ruin. The waves would widen this fissure. Salt would grow its crystals inside it and pry it apart. The rot had begun, and the rest was only a question of how many winters. Demetrios looked at the crack. Then he looked at Lucius. And to the Gaul's amazement, he smiled. Not the smile of a man who does not understand. The smile of a man who has understood for a very long time, indulging a clever pupil who has not caught up. He said nothing. He raised a hand and gestured for Lucius to wait. "Hold the picture there." The satisfied engineer, the weeping crack, the old Greek's patience. "Now, leave the sunlit wall behind and go down into the stone itself, into the dark world beneath the surface that no eye on that breakwater could see. Follow the water as it slips into the fissure and works its way deeper toward the heart of the structure. The crack branches as it goes, a small river system feeling out the easiest path. Then it strikes something. One of the white chalky lumps that Lucius had marked that morning with such contempt. A lime clast. To him it had been proof of a botched mix, a soft point waiting to fail. Here, in the dark, it turns into the wall's hidden weapon. The seawater reaches the clast and begins to dissolve the reactive calcium locked inside it. A reaction that has lain still for months wakes. The dissolved calcium, carried on the moving water, seeps into the finest ends of the crack. As the water grows thick with it, the solution does the thing no Roman on the surface could have named. It recrystallizes. It sets as new solid calcite, and that new solid grows across the gap and stitches the crack shut from the inside. The flaw was never a weakness. It was a store of healing agent, hundreds of small repair kits scattered through the concrete, each one waiting for damage to switch it on. The structure was turning the attack into its own cure. The wound was the trigger for the mending. "Come back up to the surface and the light." Demetrios finally spoke. "We see them now and then," he said, his voice calm under the beat of the waves. "Mostly after a winter storm. They always seem to close up again within a few weeks." He shrugged, and the shrug held a whole world of knowledge, with none of the theory behind it. He did not know the chemistry. He had never seen a lime classed, turned to powder, and studied. He knew only the result. His teachers and their teachers had built with this stuff for generations, handing down the method, refining it by failure after failure. They knew you mixed the lime hot. They knew you never slaked it first. They could not tell you why, but they knew it made a concrete that lived, a material that bled, then scabbed, then stood harder than before. Demetrios told him then of a storm 3 winters back, the worst the coast had seen in his time on it. A gale out of the west had piled the sea against the unfinished mole for 2 days and nights. Men had stood on the shore, certain the whole northern arm would go. Josephus writes of storms that tore at Herod's works, and of how the king answered every setback by pouring in more. When the wind dropped, Demetrios said, the wall stood, cracked in a dozen places, weeping like this one, but standing. By spring, the cracks had sealed themselves. The men who had prayed for the wall now spoke of it as if it had a will of its own. Lucius stared at the crack, then at the old man, and felt the ground of his own certainty shift under him. What he had written down as a defect was in truth a piece of design so quiet, it looked like carelessness. The sloppy, dangerous, heretical mixing was no error at all. It was the deliberate step that gave the material the power to mend its own bones. He thought of Vitruvius again, of the master who had filled a scroll with proportion and rule and had missed this entirely, because the men who knew it had never written it down, and never would. The knowledge did not live in Rome's libraries. It lived in the hands of an old Greek on a wall in Judea, and in the muscle memory of the boys hauling ash below. He thought too of the aqueducts he had helped raise in Gaul, the arches over the river valleys, the concrete cores hidden inside the dressed stone. He had believed he understood that material. He had signed his name to it. Now he saw he had been building with a thing whose deepest property he had never suspected, trusting a strength he could not explain. The realization did not comfort him. It left him feeling like a man who has spoken a language all his life and just learned he never knew its grammar. Yet the secret ran deeper still, and stranger. The self-healing was only the first face of it. The work of later geologists, among them Marie Jackson, has uncovered a second mechanism, slower and greater. As the seawater soaks through the pores of the concrete, it does more than trip a repair. It begins an act of creation. The water, loaded with salts and minerals, reacts with the volcanic ash, the pulvis puteolanus itself. The ash dissolves by degrees, giving up its aluminium and its silica. Those elements join with the calcium from the lime in the presence of the sea and grow entirely new crystals, rare and hard. Their names are aluminous, tobermorite, and phillipsite. They do not merely fill the gaps. They grow inside the original pores, locking into one another, weaving a crystalline mesh that leaves the whole wall denser and less prone to fracture than it was on the day the barges tipped it into the bay. The sea was not merely being held off by the wall. The sea was becoming the wall. Every wave that broke, every drop that seeped in, was not an act of ruin, but a contribution, a slow and patient reinforcement that would run on for centuries. The Romans had not built a material that resisted the ocean. They had built one that took the ocean into partnership. Lucius had spent the day certain he was watching a war. He had been watching a marriage. Set that against the concrete of Lucius's own age, and the strangeness sharpens. The steel-reinforced concrete of the modern world begins to fail within decades. Seawater eats the steel from within. The rust swells, and the stone bursts from the pressure of its own bones rotting. The great harbors of the last 100 years crumble, while divers still measure the Roman moles and find them holding. The men on this breakwater had solved, without a word of theory, a problem their descendants would not crack for 2,000 years, and would then only half understand. There is a bitter footnote the sea would write later. Caesarea's harbor, the marvel Herod poured his treasury into, did not last as long as its own concrete. Within a century or so, the outer basin began to sink, the seabed beneath it giving way, and Josephus's grandchildren would have known a port already failing. The stone did its work. The ground betrayed it. The blocks that Lucius watched go under would still be sound 2,000 years on, resting on a floor that had dropped away beneath them. Proof that the Romans had solved the smaller problem and never the larger one. But that ruin lay far past this afternoon, and Lucius could not see it. He saw only a wall that would not die. There was politics in the wall too, if a man knew how to read it. Herod dedicated the finished city in 10 or 9 BC with games he modeled on the great contests of Greece, to be held every 4 years, and he named them for the emperor. Josephus records the crowds, the athletes, the beasts brought in for the shows, the sheer expense poured out to make Rome take notice. The whole city, harbor and temple and games alike, was a single sustained act of a client king proving his worth to a master who could revoke him with a letter. The concrete under Lucius's knees was the load-bearing part of that argument. If it failed, Herod's boast failed with it, and Herod, whom Augustus once joked he would rather be than a member of his own family, knew exactly how thin the ice beneath a king's favor could be. The knowledge needed to open these ancient structures and read their chemistry is the fruit of decades of hard investigation. The research beneath this story is a monument in its own right. The sourcebook behind this script is a work of imperial scholarship, a full descent into the lost craft of Roman engineering, and it is available to you right now, alongside a curated set of other imperial pieces, by clicking the View Products button on your screen. If you want to hold the foundation of today's story in your own hands, this is the book to own. We have gathered other relics of Rome as well, themed artifacts, to round out your collection and tie you to the world we are exploring here. Open the shop shelf on your screen. Look through what we have found. You can browse while the story goes on. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun had dropped, throwing long shadows across the harbor, and the wind had risen. The sea had gone a deeper, harder blue, and moved with more weight against the mole. The last barges of the day were being winched back to shore, their empty holds riding high, and the drum on the breakwater had gone silent. Somewhere behind him, a foreman was counting the day's pours aloud to a clerk, who scratched them onto a tablet, the numbers that would one day feed a report to Rome. Lucius stood alone on the breakwater, having sent Demetrios away with a nod. He walked back to the place where he had found the crack and knelt beside it again. Not as a critic this time, as a student. He looked closely. The slow weeping had already lessened. It was faint, almost lost, but the dark line ran drier than it had 3 hours before. The wall was closing itself while he watched. He reached out and laid his hand against the stone. His first inspection had been an interrogation, the hand hunting for a place to break the thing open. This touch was another kind of thing entirely. He felt the vast, living solidity under his palm and could not name the feeling that came with it. He listened to the waves, and the sound had changed its meaning without changing its pitch. It was no longer the noise of a siege, of an enemy hammering the gate. It was the sound of 1,000 small hammers at work, a steady rhythmic labor that was not tearing the wall down, but tempering it, hardening it, buying it its centuries. The sun sank toward the open water. Lucius had come to condemn a building. He was leaving having met something that was, in every sense that mattered, alive. And that was the thought that stopped him where he knelt. If these men could build a thing that grew stronger, the harder the world struck it, and could do so without knowing why, without a single line of the chemistry written anywhere, then the secret he had been sent across the sea to steal was not a recipe at all. It was something no scroll could hold, something that would die with the last hand that remembered the trick of it. He rose slowly, salt drying tight on his face, and understood for the first time that the knowledge in front of him wasn't being kept. It was being lost, one funeral at a time, and no one on this shore had noticed. The 9th hour of the evening. Inside his tent, furnished with a campaign desk and a stool, Lucius worked by the light of one oil lamp, the wick guttered in the draft off the sea. Beyond the canvas, the surf beat on, muffled and steady. The dust of the day was washed from his skin, but not from his mind. He was not drawing the harbor as it stood. He was drawing it as a web of forces, arches, and buttresses that didn't exist on the site, hunting for the structural logic he was sure had to be hiding somewhere in it. He was trying to render what he had seen into the only tongue he trusted, the tongue of Vitruvius, of columns that bear load and stresses that can be counted. The pieces refused to lock together. Outside, the camp was settling for the night. The clatter of the mess had died. From the direction of the shore came the low talk of a watch changing, and somewhere a Judean laborer sang low in Aramaic, a tune Lucius did not know, that stopped when a foreman barked. He had eaten little. On the table beside the tablet lay the day's other work, a copy of his notes meant for the man who had sent him, a report bound for a desk in the West. That was the part that troubled him most. He had come to write a warning. He no longer knew what to write. He read back his own morning hand, and did not like the man who had written it. Impurity, heresy, insanity. Each word had been true to what he knew, and false to what he had seen. To send the report as written was to condemn a thing that worked, on the authority of a book that had missed it. To rewrite it was to admit that everything he had carried across the sea, his training, his master, his certainty, had been the wrong tool for the wall in front of him. This is the knot Lucius could not untie, and it is the true riddle of Roman concrete. By any modern measure, the material is poor. Its resistance to crushing is a fraction of what a builder today would demand under a tower's footing. Pull it or bend it and it snaps, because it has almost no tensile strength at all. It does not set in hours or days, but creeps toward hardness over months, slow and hard to predict. It is riddled with the very impurities Lucius had marked with contempt that morning. So the question stands and grows sharper the longer you hold it. Why did it last? Why do structures made from a material so plainly inferior still stand after 20 centuries, while our own, harder, cleverer creations begin to fall apart inside a single lifetime? The answer is not in the concrete. The answer is in the steel. Picture the cross-section of a modern bridge. Its strength is a borrowed thing. The power does not live in the stone, but in a hidden cage of steel bars, the rebar buried inside it. That skeleton is what gives the modern age its miracles. It carries the tension the concrete cannot, and it lets builders throw up thin, soaring spans that look as though they should fall. We build higher, wider, with far less material than any Roman imagined possible, all on the strength of that partnership between two substances. But the partnership carries its own death warrant. The steel is also a slow poison sealed inside the wall. From the moment it is cast in, it begins to die. Water, the patient killer Lucius respected on the breakwater, finds its way through the porous stone and reaches the metal. The steel rusts. Rust swells. It pushes outward with a force nothing can resist, and it breaks the structure from within, splitting the concrete off its own bones. Modern concrete is therefore built with a date of death already inside it. An engineer can calculate, to the decade, how long before the rebar rots and the span comes down. We raise monuments designed to be thrown away. The Roman answer grew out of a lack, and it produced a different way of seeing the world. They had no high-tension steel. They could build no hidden skeleton to cover their material's weakness. So they were driven to design in shapes that never let the concrete be pulled apart at all. They could only build with forms that held the material in compression, the one force it handled like a master. From that single limitation came their greatest works: the arch, the vault, the dome. An arch is not merely a graceful curve. It is a machine that takes the downward pull of gravity and turns it sideways, channeling it as compression down its legs and into the ground, where the material is strong. Stand under the Pantheon in Rome. Its unreinforced concrete dome still the widest in the world after nearly 2,000 years, and you are standing inside an argument about how to flatter a weak material until it behaves like a strong one. Agrippa raised the first temple on that spot, the same Agrippa who dredged harbors and drained lakes for Augustus, the same friend Herod courted when he showed off Caesarea. The dome that stands now was rebuilt under Hadrian, its portico still carrying Agrippa's name across the front, in letters a man can read from the square. The builders graded their aggregate as the dome rose. Heavy basalt low down, light porous pumice near the crown, so the top weighed less than the base. They knew their concrete not as one fixed recipe, but as a family of mixtures, each tuned to its task. They did not fight the limits of the stuff, they built with them. There is a proof of the method that Lucius could never have seen, because it had not yet happened. In AD 79, Vesuvius, the same mountain that gave up the gray ash for Caesarea, buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under fire and stone. The volcano that fed the harbors killed the towns beneath it. Pliny the Elder, admiral of the fleet at Misenum, sailed toward the eruption to help and died on the shore choked by its fumes, and his nephew wrote the account we still read. And in the ruins, the concrete held. Vaults that had roofed baths and cisterns came through the eruption and the centuries and stood for the diggers who found them. The same earth that Rome shipped across the sea to build with was the earth that destroyed the cities at its foot. The Romans used a volcano to hold back an ocean and never remarked on the strangeness of it. Inside the tent, Lucius reached his own turn. He shoved the wax tablet away, and the lamplight caught the anger in his face. He had been reasoning like a Roman engineer, but a Roman engineer of roads and forts, a man who thought in walls. And Caesarea's harbor is not a wall. He took up the stylus again, but he did not sketch. He stared at the great blank space on the plan that stood for the open sea. The breakwater was not a barrier holding the water off. It was a mountain range, an engineered geology. Its strength came from no clever trick of design and no perfect formula. It came from mass beyond reckoning. This was the last piece. The Romans had answered a weak material by using an empire's worth of it, pouring hundreds of thousands of tons into the sea until the structure was so heavy the Mediterranean broke on it as it breaks on a natural headland. It never needed strength and tension. Its own colossal weight kept it forever in compression, pressed down into permanence, by nothing but itself. And that is why the recipe was lost. Not because it was ever a secret written in code, because the civilization that made it necessary ceased to exist. To build like this, you needed more than volcanic ash. You needed a state that could quarry that ash and ship it across a whole sea. You needed a government able to fund a work that dwarfed the cathedrals of later ages. And most of all, you needed the nerve, the calm and total confidence to plan for 1,000 years of unbroken use. The Romans built this way because they believed without doubt that the Roman world would still be standing in a millennium to use what they left behind. The recipe did not vanish from a book. It vanished on the day that belief died. The machine that carried mountains across the sea fell silent. We can read the chemistry now. We can copy the hot mixing and the lime clasts in a laboratory. What we cannot easily copy is the certainty. We have lost the nerve to build for a future we will not live to see. Consider what it took to move a single cargo of that ash. The ships loaded at Puteoli in the bay under Vesuvius, the busiest port of Italy before Rome dredged Ostia into rivalry. A deep-hulled freighter rode low with the gray weight in its hold and beat east along the sea lanes for weeks, past Crete, past Cyprus, past the reach of any patrol that could save it from a storm. Cassius Dio and the others record how a bad grain season could starve Rome and topple the peace of the city. So the sea lanes were the empire's lifeline and its obsession. Onto those same lanes, Herod threw his ash ships, competing for hulls and crews and fair winds, so that a mountain near Naples could be reassembled off the coast of Judea. Every block that went under the waves that afternoon had crossed 1,000 miles of open water first. The harbor was the visible end of an invisible machine that spanned the whole sea. The scale of it becomes real only in the price. Josephus tells us Herod spent without limit on his building, that he taxed his kingdom hard and gave lavishly to Rome to keep his standing, and that his subjects groaned under the weight of it. He built not only Caesarea, but the fortress at Masada, the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, whole cities named for the emperor and his family. He gave money to Athens, to Rhodes, to Sparta, to the Olympic Games themselves, paying to become the patron of contests 1,000 miles from his throne. A client king could not conquer his way to greatness, for Rome forbade it. So he purchased greatness in stone and in gifts, and the harbor was the largest check he ever wrote. The men who dug the ash and the farmers who paid the tax never saw the ships come in. They saw the tax collector. Rome watched all of it with a cold eye. Augustus had ended the civil wars only a decade before the harbor was begun, and he ruled a world exhausted and eager for order. He needed grain, he needed quiet provinces, and he needed client kings who would keep both flowing without an army of his own to garrison the east. Herod was exactly such a man, and both of them knew the arrangement rested on nothing but the emperor's continued favor. Suetonius records how carefully Augustus managed even the men who served him, rewarding loyalty and remembering slights. A harbor named Sebastos was a bid for that memory, a monument that said to Rome, "Forget me at your peril, for see what I have made in your name." The concrete was the medium, the message was survival. The 11th hour of the night. Lucius pinched out the lamp. He had no more use for it. He set down the stylus with the feeling of a man who has finished a task he did not know he had been given. He understood at last that he had not been sent to Judea to watch a harbor go up. He had been sent to witness a statement about power, about time, about the arrogance of permanence. Herod was not only building a port to please the masters who kept him on his throne, he was cutting his name and the name of Rome into the bedrock of the world, using a method that bent the planet's own forces to serve a client king's fear. Herod would not see his own permanence. He died in 4 BC, a few years after the games that dedicated the city, his last months darkened by illness and by the killing of his own sons, so that Augustus was said to have remarked, "It was safer to be the king's pig than the king's boy." His kingdom was carved up among heirs who could not hold it. Within 70 years of the harbor's dedication, Judea rose against Rome, and legions under Vespasian and then Titus crushed the revolt and burned the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. Caesarea itself became the seat of the Roman governors, the place from which the province was ruled by the very power Herod had tried to flatter. Pontius Pilate governed from here, and an inscription bearing his name was later dug from the theater Herod built, the only stone that carries his title still. The city outlived the king by centuries. The concrete outlived the city. And the ash, torn from a mountain near Naples, is still down there in the seabed off Israel, still hardening, long after every man who quarried it and shipped it and poured it went into the ground. The modern hunger for this ancient material is not driven by any wish to raise new pantheons. Our age has little use for monuments meant to outlast everyone who remembers why they were built. Our interest comes from a quieter place, closer to alarm. Our own short-lived materials, our disposable bridges and failing roads, cost us more than money. The making of modern cement pours a heavy share of the world's carbon into the sky because it demands furnaces at temperatures the Romans never needed. Their way, worked at lower heat with the Earth's own volcanic gifts, was far cleaner. We study their immortal walls not to learn how to build for a long future, but because we have begun to fear the bill for our own short one. There is a last irony in the timing. The men who first proved the chemistry of these lime clasts did so with instruments Herod could not have imagined, firing beams of light at fragments of the ancient stone to watch the crystals grow. They confirmed, in a laboratory, what an old Greek foreman on a wall in Judea had known in his hands and could not explain. 2,000 years of knowledge, lost and then recovered, closing at last on the same simple truth. The concrete heals because the sea feeds it. Demetrius could have told them that. He would only have shrugged. And Lucius, who came the closest of any Roman we can name to writing it down, wrote nothing that survived. Whatever report left that tent has vanished, as reports do, into the fire and the damp, and the indifference of the centuries. The knowledge stayed in the hands, passed from foreman to apprentice, until the hands stopped, and the last of them died, with the world that fed them. The wall remembered, the men did not. Turn back one last time to the harbor at night. The moon rides high and lays a silver road across the black water. The only sound is the endless, even crash of the sea against the mole. The same sound Lucius heard, the same force. It is not tearing the wall down, it is feeding it. It is finishing it. For 2,000 years, that sound has been an act of maintenance, drop by drop, wave by wave. The wall is stronger tonight than it was on the morning Lucius sailed for home. Somewhere out on that dark water, an old Cypriot diver's grandchildren would grow old, and the wall would go on, growing quietly harder beneath them, indifferent to every name that had been carved to claim it. The difference between their world and ours is not a lost ingredient. It is not a burned book of engineering. It is the answer to one plain and merciless question. What are you building it for? And how long do you truly expect to be here to see it stand? Thank you for staying with this investigation all the way to the end. If the story has left its mark on you, take a moment to subscribe, to like this video, and to send it to someone who ought to see how clearly the ancient world can hold a mirror to our own. You've just watched another premium documentary by Romanus, your home of Roman Empire, on YouTube. The story does not end at this shore. The video now rising onto your screen is the next chapter of your descent into the dark heart of Rome. Click it. Watch it now. Keep going.